He was born a victor, but died defeated. He walked into the Kremlin without knocking. He flew into the sky like a true ace. He carried a name that made the nation tremble. The son of Joseph Stalin, an aviation general, a war hero, and the most dangerous man for the new leadership after his father's death. Why did someone raised in privilege end his life in exile and isolation? How could a pilot who shot down enemy aircraft fail to prevent the crash of his own destiny? Why did a man celebrated for victories in war fall to the bottle in peacetime faster than to bullets? How did the name that once granted power become a mark that slowly pushed him toward self-destruction? In this story, there is no justice, no victors, only truth, and an ending that can no longer be changed. Watch until the end. Because the life of Vasily Stalin is not just a biography, it is a verdict on an era in which even the son of the ruler could not defeat the most dangerous enemy, himself. Heir without a throne. Who was he, the second son of the leader? Vasily Yosifovich Stalin was born on the 20th of March, 1921 in Moscow. He was the second son of Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin and his second wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva. From the moment of his birth, his life was inseparably bound to the history of a family whose name would become a symbol of an entire era. An era of fear, victory, and ruthless power. The house in which he grew up stood in the very heart of the Kremlin. It was not simply a home. It was a carefully guarded world where a child's laughter mingled with the echo of centuries' footsteps, and every word spoken by his parents could shape the destinies of millions. Historians still debate whether Vasily was a happy child or whether he already sensed the weight of his surname. One thing, however, is indisputable. His childhood was extraordinary and riddled with contradiction. On one hand, he enjoyed privileges unavailable to the vast majority of children in the country. Personal toys from abroad, the best tutors, separate rooms for play where he could carelessly spend his time while matters of war and peace were being decided around him. On the other hand, there was constant supervision, fear of his father, and the stern discipline imposed by his mother, who tolerated no whims. Psychologists studying his biography later wrote, "He grew up in an atmosphere of love mixed with the coldness of political terror." Nadezhda Alliluyeva attempted to raise her son according to her own principles, which were gentler than those of his father. She dreamed that, despite the political climate, her children would live an ordinary life. Yet she tragically took her own life in November 1932, when Vasily was only 11 years old. This death became the first profound trauma, leaving a mark on the rest of his life. After his mother's death, his upbringing fell entirely under the control of his father. But Joseph Stalin was a man of a very different nature. He rarely showed emotion, was stern, and demanded unquestioning obedience. In adulthood, Vasily often recalled to friends how he feared his father's anger, how any disobedience could result in hours of silent and chilling intimidation. This fear, intertwined with a desire to prove his strength to his father, planted within him an insatiable drive toward daring actions and risky behavior. At the same time, he grew up amid the rising cult of personality. Already in the early 1930s, one could see posters with Stalin's face in the streets, slogans praising the wise leader, and newspaper articles elevating him to the level of a demigod. Vasily understood perfectly that his surname opened doors that would remain closed forever for others. But he also saw the reverse side of that power. Whispered conversations among guards, fear in subordinates' eyes, mysterious disappearances of acquaintances whom no one mentioned again. His first teachers remembered him as a lively and restless child. He loved sports, especially horseback riding, and from an early age he showed a passion for aviation, which at that time was considered a symbol of romance and courage. Yet alongside these interests, he was known for his unruly temperament and quickness to anger, intolerant of refusal and accustomed to getting whatever he wanted. These traits, ingrained in childhood, would later lead him into conflict with military commanders and even party officials. Around the family, there existed a special inner circle. The sons and daughters of other Soviet leaders were the only children of his age with whom Vasily could interact without excessive formality. It was a closed, elite childhood society that lived by unwritten rules fundamentally different from those of ordinary Soviet school children. They had access to the best entertainment, rare food products, fashionable clothing, foreign books, and imported toys. Yet each of them understood that even the smallest mistake could escalate into a political scandal that would reach the leader himself. Even during those years, Vasily felt that he was an heir without a throne. He had no political future. Stalin never intended his children to become his successors. Nevertheless, people looked at him as the family's symbol, as someone who was obliged to be strong, courageous, and beyond reproach. This invisible burden, imposed by both society and his father, weighed on him from an early age, turning his childhood into a series of tests he could not always pass. Historians assert that it was precisely in these early years that Vasily's character was forged. A blend of bravery and rebellion, fear and a thirst for recognition. He grew up in a world where love was replaced by power and trust by fear, and this world inevitably prepared the ground for the tragedy of his adult life. His journey began like a fairy tale about a prince from the Kremlin. But even in childhood it was clear. This was a tale without a happy ending. Youth amidst privilege, a fiery temper, and the reputation of a crown prince. Vasily Stalin's school years fell in the late 1920s and early 1930s, when the country already lived under the rising cult of his father. He studied at the Kremlin School, a closed institution created specifically for the children of the party elite. Admission was granted only by special order, and studying within those walls meant one thing. The children beside you were those whose parents dictated the fate of millions. Teachers remembered Vasily as an active and restless student. He loved physical education, and from an early age showed a passion for horseback riding and aviation. But he struggled with exact sciences. Mathematics and physics were difficult for him, and teachers often ignored his poor performance, knowing whose signature was attached to his personal file. Among his peers, Vasily quickly gained a reputation as a troublemaker. He could start a fight, insult an offender, and sometimes stage loud incidents that resulted in other children's parents being sent into exile or reprimanded by the Central Committee. From a young age, he took advantage of his status. Historians note that Vasily became accustomed to the idea that the name Stalin opened every door. He was allowed more than others. Late-night gatherings, walks beyond the Kremlin walls, horseback rides across Red Square, even unsanctioned trips out of town, accompanied by guards. Sometimes the security staff complained to his father about his behavior. But Stalin's reaction varied unpredictably. From silent indifference to harsh punishment that left the boy subdued for weeks. During the 1930s, sport rose in popularity in the USSR as a means of shaping the new man. Vasily became passionate about horseback riding and ice hockey, and later about flying. By the age of 12, he was attending an aero club, where he first took to the sky. Pilots recalled that the leader's son feared neither speed nor danger, but discipline was a struggle for him. He loved the feeling of flight, but could not tolerate being given orders. The family's private life during these years remained a closed subject. After his mother's tragic death in 1932, the house grew colder. Stalin was increasingly away on official business, while Vasily and his sister Svetlana remained in the care of nannies and guards. They were rarely permitted to walk without escort. In the streets of Moscow, mass arrests were already taking place. Families they knew disappeared, and even Vasily's childhood was permeated with anxiety. In Svetlana's recollections, she writes that her brother understood early. The Stalin family did not live in safety, but under siege. Everything around them was guarded, controlled, recorded. Any conversation could end up as a report on their father's desk. This constant shadow over childhood made Vasily closed off and suspicious of those around him, although outwardly he appeared loud and carefree. His attitude toward his father's power stood apart. For the boy, Joseph Vissarionovich was both a hero and a terrifying force. Vasily admired the legend of Stalin created by newspapers and school textbooks. Yet at home he saw a cold, sometimes harsh man, intolerant of weakness. He grew up with conflicting feelings. He wanted to be like his father, yet tried to escape his shadow through rebellious acts, a thirst for danger, and displays of independence. In 1934, Vasily found himself at the center of scandal for the first time. During a school event, he instigated a fight that required the intervention of guards and party officials. The incident was hushed up, blame was placed on others, but it demonstrated one fact. The boy was accustomed to living by special rules beyond the reach of ordinary children. It was during these years that the belief in his own impunity took root, a belief that would later play a fatal role in his destiny. His teenage world was one of stark contrasts. The luxury of Kremlin offices, foreign toys, and delicacies existed alongside the history of a country where millions lived in poverty, perished in labor camps, and vanished without trace. But he was too young to comprehend the scale of the tragedy and saw what surrounded him as the natural order. Vasily grew into a prince without a throne, heir to a name that allowed no room for mistakes, but encouraged a belief that he stood above the law. Youth in privilege shaped who he would become. A man sharp in manner, convinced that life owed him everything immediately. These traits, nurtured within the Kremlin walls, determined his path, a path where triumph and downfall would replace each other with alarming speed. War, a hero, or simply the leader's son. The Great Patriotic War changed the fate of millions, and Vasily Stalin was no exception. From the very beginning of military action, he was eager to reach the front. In the summer of 1941, when German forces advanced toward Moscow, Vasily, then 20 years old, insisted that he must fly and fight like everyone else. For him, it was a chance to prove to his father and to the country that he was not merely the leader's son, but a true officer. He had formally been registered in Red Army Air Force units since the late 1930s and trained at the Katya Pilot School. But war became the true test. Stalin did not immediately agree to send his son into active combat. The leader's inner circle feared that Vasily's capture or death could damage the prestige of Soviet power. But the young Stalin asserted his will, convincing generals and his father that he must be at the front. Historians cite his words, "I will not sit in the rear while others die in the sky." Vasily began service in an aviation regiment assigned to defend Moscow. His first combat flights took place in the winter of 1941. Contemporaries recalled that he flew boldly, sometimes recklessly, breaking regulations in his pursuit of personal glory. In some operations, he demonstrated genuine courage, shooting down German aircraft. But persistent rumors claimed that the best pilots of the country always flew alongside him, effectively ensuring his safety. Official documents recorded his participation in more than 30 combat missions during the first 2 years of the war. He was awarded the Orders of the Red Banner and the Red Star. Yet even honors could not silence the question. Was he truly a hero? Or were his exploits exaggerated and embellished for the press? Vasily reacted painfully to any doubt regarding his bravery. He sought frontline glory while fully aware that his father's name would follow him throughout life, overshadowing his own achievements. Military aviation at the time was a school of endurance and discipline. Pilots lived on the brink of exhaustion, flew in blizzards and bitter cold, and returned in aircraft riddled with bullets. Despite his privileges, Vasily endured these hardships. He slept in tents, ate modestly, and spent long hours awaiting orders. Fellow servicemen remembered him as a daring, at times reckless pilot, willing to perform hazardous maneuvers or engage the enemy alone to demonstrate his skill. But his temperament showed itself even at the front. He frequently argued with commanders, rejected criticism, and demanded special treatment. Some senior officers filed complaints about his rudeness and drinking, but such reports disappeared in the offices of high-ranking officials. Whether they feared the leader's anger or simply wished to avoid conflict with his son remains difficult to determine. In the winter of 1943, Vasily was appointed commander of an aviation regiment. For a regular officer, such rapid promotion would have been impossible. It is evident that his surname played a part. Yet the regiment included dozens of experienced pilots, and holding the position without skill would have been unthinkable. Vasily managed to establish himself as a decisive commander, willing to take risks alongside his subordinates. He often flew at the head of a group and preferred to personally take part in the most difficult missions. The war years left a permanent mark on his psyche. He became accustomed to living on the edge, tasting danger and victory. Alcohol and all-night drinking sessions became permanent features of his officer lifestyle. Frontline comrades recalled that Vasily could drink an entire bottle of pure spirit in one evening, and then sit in the cockpit the next morning as if nothing had happened. These habits would remain with him after the war and eventually contribute to tragedy. By the end of the war, he already held the rank of Major General of Aviation, becoming one of the youngest generals in the Red Army. Newspapers described him as a hero, the leader's heir, the defender of the motherland. But behind the grand words lay questions. How many victories were real, and how many were embellished by party journalists? Could some of his exploits have been invented to uphold the aura of the invincible Stalin family? Such doubts haunted him throughout his life. Even the victory over Germany did not erase the stigma of being Stalin's son. He succeeded in proving his courage to fellow soldiers, but the country never truly learned whether he was a genuine hero or merely the shadow of a great father flying under the protection of an invisible escort. Years of glory, and the first falls. What broke the leader's son? Victory in the Great Patriotic War brought Vasily Stalin not only general shoulder boards, but all Union fame. Newspapers wrote about him as an outstanding pilot, a commander, a brave officer with no equal in the skies. The Stalin name on front pages turned him into a national hero, the embodiment of the young Soviet elite forged in the fire of war. But along with honors came what would soon become his curse, a sense of total permissiveness, reinforced by power and the fear of those around him. After the war, Vasily continued his service in aviation. He was appointed commander of a long-range bomber division. He was only 24 years old and already a major general commanding highly experienced officers and war heroes. For the army of that era, this was unprecedented. An ordinary pilot might have waited decades to attain such a post. But the leader's son reached the top almost instantly. Even his most loyal subordinates understood his surname opened doors faster than any act of heroism. At that time, Soviet aviation was undergoing active rearmament. After the war, the USSR acquired captured German technologies and began creating new jet aircraft. Vasily often visited test airfields, spoke with designers, and demanded the impossible from them. Higher speeds, greater range, more powerful weapons. He dreamed of Soviet aviation becoming the best in the world and used his influence to push decisions in his favor. Sometimes this benefited the cause, but more often it led to conflict with high-ranking officers unwilling to submit to a young general. Vasily's personal life during these years turned into a chain of scandals and stories whispered in the corridors of power. Alcohol became his passion. The front-line habit of relieving stress with a glass grew into constant drinking. He hosted loud parties attended by officers, athletes, actresses, and foreign guests. Historians recall one episode. Vasily, drunk, raced a car across Red Square, almost causing a disaster. Security officers barely managed to stop the vehicle. And the incident, like many others, was swiftly hushed up. Vasily's marriages became a favorite subject of gossip. His first marriage, concluded soon after the war, ended in a scandalous divorce. Later, he married the actress Lyudmila Timofeyeva, and then Maria Shverubovich. Each time the union was accompanied by violent quarrels, jealousy, and fits of rage. He did not know how to build a family. He was used to having every one of his wishes fulfilled immediately. His relationship with his father during this period remained complicated. Joseph Vissarionovich was displeased with his son's dissipated lifestyle, but rarely intervened. Once, upon learning of a drunken rampage by Vasily at an airfield, Stalin ordered that his son be deprived of his car and security detail for a month. But the punishment did nothing to change his character. He continued to roam the streets at night, drink and argue with commanders, certain that his surname would save him from consequences. In his professional sphere, the first clouds were already gathering by the late 1940s. Some of his orders led to mistakes and accidents. Officers complained about chaos in the management of the division, but reports once again vanished at higher levels. Whether they were covered up by Stalin himself or by officers who feared jeopardizing relations with his family, remains unknown to this day. Despite mistakes and personal scandals, Vasily continued to climb the career ladder. He was appointed commander of the Air Force of the Moscow Military District. An enormous responsibility for a man who had just turned 28. This appointment became a symbol of how the leader's dynasty had penetrated every level of power, including the army. But with the new post came new problems, even greater responsibility, even more attention to his actions, and most importantly, even more temptations. The years of glory were also the years of his first falls. Every day Vasily balanced between the heroic image of the leader's son and the reality of a man who could not live within boundaries and did not understand the word no. That period laid the foundation for the future tragedies that would overtake him after his father's death, when the shield of the great name would disappear and the consequences of his past sins would crash down on him in full. The father's shadow, fear, and power. Can the son escape the leader's influence? To serve and to live beside the figure of Joseph Stalin was a trial even for hardened party members. For Vasily, this trial lasted his entire life. He was not an ordinary officer, not simply the son of the generalissimo. He was the leader's son, a man on whom, from early childhood, lay the weight of another's power, of fear and reverence that permeated the entire Soviet apparatus. In the post-war years, Joseph Vissarionovich controlled not only the country, but every movement of his children. He was a demanding and harsh father, rarely showing tenderness and even more rarely praise. From childhood, Vasily lived in a world where a mistake could become a disgrace and disobedience a tragedy. Even as an adult officer and general, he feared his father's gaze more than any battle at the front. Historians recount an episode from the late 1940s when Vasily, already commander of the Air Force of the Moscow Military District, allowed a serious aviation incident to occur. During exercises, an aircraft crashed and the pilots were killed. The investigation established that the cause was haste and errors in preparation stemming from Vasily's orders. The report landed on Stalin's desk. The conversation between father and son was brief and brutal. Threats and cold words about disgracing the family. After this, Vasily did not appear in public for several weeks, shutting himself in his house, where he drowned his guilt and fear in glasses of vodka. The father's shadow followed him even where it seemed he was achieving success. Any award, any promotion was accompanied by whispers. It is because of his surname. Any mistake became the subject of discussion at the highest levels, and many longed to see the leader's son fall, to prove that blood and a name did not decide everything. His relationship with his father was full of contradictions. On the one hand, Vasily sincerely loved Joseph Vissarionovich and strove to earn his approval. On the other, he hated the endless supervision and fear that surrounded the family. Every word, every action was judged through the prism of the surname. He could not allow himself simple joys, to walk with friends, to choose a life partner without interference from his father or his inner circle. Everyone understood. If the leader's son married or befriended someone, it automatically became a political issue. By the late 1940s, Vasily was increasingly drawn into the atmosphere of the Kremlin court, where power and fear were bound together with intrigue and denunciations. Officers and party officials tried to stay close to him, some out of flattery, some out of fear, and some in pursuit of career advantage. His entourage increasingly comprised people who did not dare contradict him, fawned, relayed to his father whatever was convenient, and then exploited every weakness of Vasily for their own purposes. A slow corruption of his character began. The father's shadow was not only psychological pressure, it also became a real threat to those who dared oppose Vasily. Several cases in the archives indicate that officers who openly criticized his actions were soon transferred to remote garrisons or dismissed for health reasons. Whether Joseph Vissarionovich personally intervened or whether courtiers simply sought to show zeal in protecting the leader's son is unknown. But the result was the same. Vasily's power grew, and with it grew his sense of impunity. Yet he did not feel like a free man. He understood that every step he took was judged by the ultimate arbiter, his father. And that judgment was harsher than for any other citizen of the country. Stalin did not tolerate weakness. He could praise other generals for their victories, but he spoke such words to his son extremely rarely. Once, after successful exercises, Vasily dared to ask, "Well, father, are you satisfied with me now?" The reply was cold. "Do your job and do not ask." This phrase became a curse for him, proof that his father's love and recognition remained unattainable. The pressure of the father's shadow was no less palpable in his personal life. Every romance attracted the attention of the security services. Every party was discussed on Lubyanka. He lived under constant surveillance by guards, NKVD officers, secretaries, and servants. Even his own friends were afraid to speak openly with him. Any word could be overheard and interpreted as anti-Stalin. Vasily increasingly retreated into alcohol and gambling, trying to drown out this suffocating atmosphere. The power his surname gave him seemed absolute, but inside he remained a hostage of another's will. Every order, every victory, and every mistake was only a reflection of the figure towering above him. For him, Joseph Vissarionovich was both God and judge and executioner. This father's shadow, a fusion of fear and power, would become the fatal burden that Vasily would never manage to cast off. Empire of privilege and of downfall. How did the leader's son watch his world collapse? After the war and his meteoric rise through the ranks, Vasily Stalin finally came to embody the Soviet elite of the new generation. But while other children of high-ranking officials lived quietly and tried to avoid excessive attention, the leader's son lived at full speed, unbeholden to anyone or anything. His name opened the doors of any institution, and the power held by his father turned his every whim into an executed order. By the late 1940s, he had created his own empire of privilege. It was a network of military and civilian connections, clubs, restaurants, private dachas, sports teams, and theater collectives. Historians claim that Vasily could call any minister and receive a ticket, a position, a favor, or even a plane assigned for personal use. He used military airfields like a taxi service. He could wake a bomber crew in the middle of the night just to fly to Sochi or go hunting with friends. Stories of such flights spread throughout the army, yet no one dared object. Sport held a special place in his life. Fanatically devoted to ice hockey, Vasily personally oversaw the development of Soviet teams. He invited top coaches, secured enormous budgets, and forced the military to build ice rinks and facilities. He dreamed of making the USSR a global hockey power, and his influence helped that endeavor. But everything unfolded in his signature manner. Loud, confrontational, marked by threats and pressure on subordinates. Players knew that refusing General Stalin was impossible. Otherwise, they risked not only their careers, but also their peace of mind. Vasily extended his privileges to everyday life. He could move into any state-owned dacha, seize any vehicle from NKVD garages, or demand rare delicacies from the Kremlin kitchen. Officials and officers competed to win favor with the Crown Prince, as they called him behind his back. He organized boisterous feasts attended by performers, athletes, officers, and mid-level bureaucrats. At these gatherings, alcohol flowed like a river. Crude toasts were shouted, dubious deals were sealed, and legends of his reckless escapades were born. But behind this facade of total indulgence, the darkness of future collapse slowly gathered. Drunkenness became a constant part of his life. He arrived at duty intoxicated, issued absurd orders, disrupted important meetings. Officers filed reports on his behavior, but most disappeared before reaching Stalin. Those who dared complain directly to the father encountered a cold reaction. The leader disliked publicly acknowledging weaknesses within his family. Scandals piled up one after another. Vasily might engage in car races on the streets of Moscow, publicly insult a high-ranking general, or sabotage military maneuvers due to a hangover. One particularly notorious incident saw an entire bomber regiment sent into the air at night, without general staff approval, simply because Vasily wanted a celebratory salute of aircraft flying overhead. The order was carried out, but word of it reached the highest offices. Only intervention by his father's personal security prevented the matter from escalating. His financial affairs also raised concerns. Though officially living on a general's salary, his banquets featured rare wines, expensive delicacies, and gifts to artists and athletes valued at hundreds of thousands of rubles. According to survivors' accounts, the funds came from military budgets and special reserves that no one dared inspect. This became one of the reasons security services began observing Vasily, waiting for the moment when his father's protection would fade. Gradually, his inner circle transformed. Those who remained were not friends, but sycophants taking advantage of his status. He pushed away the honest and direct, fearing betrayal. Instead of advisors, he was surrounded by flatterers willing to endorse even the most absurd ideas. Thus emerged an atmosphere of artificial respect, behind which lurked resentment and a longing to witness his downfall. And yet, despite scandals and abuses, Vasily continued to serve and receive new appointments. The influence of his father was an insurmountable shield. Any accusation or investigation ended with the words, "The son of Comrade Stalin." But everyone understood the moment that shield disappeared, the empire of privilege would collapse into dust. And for his years of excess, arrogance, and disregard for law, he would pay in full. These were the years of his peak in false power and his true moral decline. He built the illusion of an invincible heir, convinced that his surname granted eternal immunity. But the system created by his father did not forgive weakness, and Vasily was too weak to understand. He lived not as master of his fate, but as the temporary heir to a crystal throne, ready to shatter at a single strike of history. The death of his father and the collapse of his world. What remained for the son after the leader was gone? The 5th of March, 1953, a date that split both the country and Vasily Stalin's life into before and after. The death of Joseph Vissarionovich struck the entire Soviet leadership. But for his younger son, it was not merely the end of an era. It was a personal catastrophe. The destruction of a world in which he had lived in fear, yet was shielded by the power of his name. In the days preceding his father's death, Vasily was present at the nearby dacha in Kuntsevo. The leader was gravely ill, suffering from a stroke, surrounded by doctors and close associates. Witnesses recalled Vasily pacing the corridors, shouting at security, demanding the best specialists, threatening anyone who delayed with arrest. He did not grasp that even his name no longer held power against fate and medical hopelessness. For the first time, the son of the great Stalin felt like a helpless child, unable to save his father. Joseph Stalin's funeral turned into a grand state spectacle. Crowds wept, thousands queued to bid farewell to the leader. And Vasily, according to eyewitnesses, was in a state of shock that shifted into angry hysteria. He shouted at marshals, accused party officials of conspiracy, claimed that his father had been murdered by doctors. Rumors spread that he intended to personally arrest several members of the government, believing them traitors. These suspicions were not accidental. After Stalin's death, a power struggle began in the Kremlin. Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, and others fought to seize control of the state, eliminating rivals. The leader's son, though without official authority, held symbolic influence, making him a threat. He knew too much, had ties within the army, and could have rallied officers loyal to his father. Vasily attempted action, gathering surviving allies, calling commanding officers, threatening to investigate his father's death. But every call was logged, every meeting reported to the new masters of the Kremlin. Within days of the funeral, he was effectively cut off from all levers of influence. Military orders that once were executed immediately were now ignored. Kremlin doors, once open without a knock, were shut. Those who only a week earlier bowed before him now avoided greeting him. Privileges vanished at alarming speed, as though they had never existed. Vasily understood that he had lost not only his father, but also the entire system of protection built around the Stalin name. He was left alone in a world where friends turned into enemies, and each tried to distance themselves to avoid association with a hated dynasty. All his past excesses, drunkenness, abuses, scandals, suddenly resurfaced. The press stayed silent, but security services gathered files, collected testimonies, and stored reports, waiting for the right moment. The leader's son drank relentlessly. At night he wandered the house, repeating one phrase: "They killed him." Killed. Historians cite testimonies from guards who saw him in utter despair, crying, stripped of all officer dignity. For him, his father's death was not only a personal tragedy, it destroyed the very meaning of his existence. He no longer knew who he was: war hero, aviation general, or simply a spoiled heir destined for trial and oblivion. Vasily's attempts to present himself as the rightful bearer of the Stalin name proved futile. The new leadership wanted no personality cult tied to the dynasty. Khrushchev and his supporters understood. If Vasily were given even the slightest opportunity, discontented officers and loyal Stalinists might rally around him. Thus, they decided to neutralize him, not by execution or open imprisonment, to avoid creating a martyr, but by slow eradication, stripping him of influence, rank, allies, and even the right to call himself the son of the great Stalin without fear. Each day after the 5th of March brought a new blow. General Vasily Stalin was gradually demoted, stripped of command, deprived of residences and vehicles, and his freedom of movement was restricted. He felt how the empire, built on his father's power and privilege, was collapsing, leaving him upon the ruins of his own fate. And ahead lay not a new life, but a descent into disgrace, exile, and oblivion. Disgrace and the first arrest. Is the leader's son now an outcast? The spring of 1953 marked the beginning of the end for Vasily Stalin. After his father's death, he remained under covert surveillance. Yet at first, he hoped that his situation would change. He believed that his name still meant something, that the army he had served would remain loyal to him. But the new leadership acted coldly and methodically, dismantling his former world piece by piece. First, he was removed from his post as commander of the Air Force of the Moscow Military District. This was explained to him as a temporary reorganization. But everyone understood that it was the first step toward complete isolation. Guards and servants assigned by the Kremlin began to disappear from his household. Telephone calls no longer brought instant solutions to his problems. Those who had recently called him Comrade General now tried to avoid even meeting his gaze. Vasily became a stranger inside a system he had considered his own. Yet he did not intend to remain silent. His drinking, already habitual, became a way to drown fear and rage. At banquets, he publicly accused the new leaders of murdering his father, calling Beria and Khrushchev traitors. Historians claim that at one such gathering he said, "These jackals killed my father, and they will destroy the country as well." The word spread through Moscow with lightning speed and quickly reached the ears of those already preparing his removal. By the summer of 1953, the decision to neutralize him had been finalized. Vasily was arrested on charges of anti-state activity, slander against the Soviet leadership, and abuse of official position. Official documents spoke of drunkenness, embezzlement of state funds, and illegal use of military aviation for personal purposes. But the real reason was that he was too dangerous as a symbol of the Stalin name, capable of uniting those who dreamed of restoring the old order. The arrest was carried out quietly, but humiliatingly. The general was summoned, supposedly for a conversation at the Ministry of Defense, and then, without further explanation, taken to Lefortovo prison. According to eyewitnesses, Vasily did not resist. He was drunk and seemed broken inside. Yet, in his cell he changed. He stopped drinking, demanded meetings with the country's leadership, and insisted on an investigation into his father's death. Day after day, he wrote statements, insisting that his case was part of a conspiracy against the Stalin family. The investigation dragged on for months. Investigators questioned his former comrades in arms and compiled folders of compromising material listing all his scandals. Night flights in bombers for festive salutes, drunkenness at headquarters, squandering resources, threats to subordinates. Every episode that people had once been afraid even to mention was now turned into a criminal charge. The system his father had built operated without pity, crushing the very man who had once been considered its heir. In the autumn of that same year, a closed trial took place. There was no public, no press, only a military tribunal, the charges and the verdict. 8 years of imprisonment, with deprivation of military rank and all awards. For the son of the man the country had called the leader of all times. This blow was worse than execution. Historians note that upon hearing the verdict, Vasily turned pale and uttered only one phrase. They forgot so quickly. He was sent to prison and then into exile. Far from Moscow, far from the army, far from anyone who still remembered his power. Yet even behind bars, he remained Vasily Stalin, a man others regarded with suspicion, sometimes with respect, sometimes with hatred. He still believed that one day he would return, prove his truth, and avenge his father's enemies. But the first years of imprisonment finally severed the last ties between him and the world in which the Stalin name had meant power. Now it had become a curse, a brand that would never be washed away for the rest of his life. Life in exile, and attempts to return. Can the leader's son rise again? The winter of 1954 greeted Vasily Stalin not with parade bands and officers' salutes, but with the cold of a transit barrack. After the closed trial, he was moved from Lefortovo prison first to a camp isolation unit, then sent into exile in Ust-Kamenogorsk, far from the capitals, far from the military elite, far from any living memory of the Stalin name. For many, this served as an unspoken warning. Even the leader's son could disappear if the new authorities decided to erase him from history. The life of a disgraced former general was devoid of luxury, but not of bitter memory. He was placed in a small apartment under MGB surveillance and given a nominal job at the sports club of a local aircraft factory. Vasily was supposed to train young pilots and share his experience as a frontline airman, but this was only a facade. Agents loitered around his building, his letters were opened and read, and any attempt to contact Moscow was recorded in reports. In the first months, Vasily held himself together. He wrote letters to members of the Presidium of the Central Committee, demanded a review of his case, and claimed he had become the victim of political revenge. Historians have preserved copies of some of these appeals, in which he called the sentence, "a spit in the face of my father's memory." There was no reply. Neither Beria, nor Malenkov, nor Khrushchev intended to bring back into play a man whose name recalled the Stalin era too loudly and too dangerously. Alcohol once again became both his salvation and his curse. Vasily drank heavily, almost daily, sometimes to the point of losing consciousness. Neighbors recalled how at night he screamed in his sleep, argued with invisible enemies, demanded doctors for his father, and accused everyone around him of betrayal. Some claimed that he even attempted several times to fly to Moscow by seizing aircraft from the Aero Club. but each time the security services managed to stop him. Every such incident went into MGB reports, strengthening the legend of the unruly heir. Yet despite the drinking, Vasily did not resign himself to his fate. He looked for contacts in the army, wrote to former comrades, reminded them of wartime friendships, and asked for support. Some officers replied, but with great caution, knowing that every letter was read by the security services. There were those who promised to help restore his honor and rank, but no one dared openly challenge the new leadership. In the middle of 1956, when Khrushchev began to denounce the cult of personality, Vasily tried to obtain official rehabilitation. He submitted a petition requesting restoration of his rank and decorations, insisting he was guilty of nothing but loyalty to his father. In the petition he wrote, "I fought honestly. I gave my life to the motherland. And I was punished only because I am his son." The answer was brief and cold. "The matter has been reviewed. There are no grounds for satisfaction." This document became the final nail in the coffin of his hopes. Vasily understood that his name had become a stigma and that any mention of Stalin was now dangerous. He had turned into a living reminder of a time the party was eager to repudiate. Yet he continued to struggle. No longer for a return to power, but for the right to remain a human being rather than merely the shadow of a great tyrant. His life in exile was full of contrasts. He could spend hours telling local boys about aerial battles, frontline camaraderie, and his fellow pilots, and in those moments, he once again became a war hero. But by evening, everything returned to its old pattern. A bottle, memories, resentment, tears. He occasionally tore up old photographs with his father in a fit of rage, then painstakingly glued them back together, as if trying to reassemble from fragments his former life. Every attempt to return to Moscow ended in failure. He was denied travel permits, and any letters were returned with refusals. Vasily understood that he was under de facto lifelong surveillance. He lived like a prisoner without bars, surrounded by informers, forced daily to look into the eyes of people who knew they were facing the son of that same Stalin who had once ruled the fate of the world. Yet now was disgraced, broken, and forgotten by all. This exile lasted for years, and each passing day destroyed his health, his mind, and the last remnants of his belief in justice. But somewhere deep inside, Vasily still hoped that history would turn, that his name would be cleared, and that the Stalin surname would cease to be a sentence. He did not know that more blows lay ahead. Betrayal by friends, illness, a second exile, and a slow road toward a tragic end. Return to Moscow. And a new blow. How much more could the leader's son endure? The spring of 1957 brought Vasily Stalin the first faint signs of hope. After several years of exile, he unexpectedly received permission to return to Moscow. Officially, this decision was explained by a reduction of his sentence for good behavior. But everyone understood. It was a political maneuver, part of the thaw, as the new leadership sought to demonstrate leniency and distance itself from the harshness of the Stalin era. According to contemporaries, Vasily's return to the capital was met with silent caution. Not a single former friend dared to greet him openly at the station. Those who only a few years earlier had feasted with him through the night now lowered their eyes, afraid even to say hello. Moscow had seemingly erased from memory the name of the leader's second son. He arrived in a city where he had once been treated as a prince, yet now felt like a stranger in his own home. He was given a small apartment and ordered to behave quietly, to avoid politics and not to mention the past. But Vasily did not know how to stay silent. He continued to believe that his father's death was the result of a conspiracy among his closest associates, that the truth must be spoken, and that he was duty-bound to restore the honor of the Stalin name. He voiced these thoughts in small gatherings, sometimes in restaurants, sometimes during drunken conversations with former fellow officers. Every such discussion quickly came to the attention of the authorities. Historians claim that during this period, Vasily began collecting documents on the final days of his father's life. He met with former guards, doctors, and generals, trying to piece together the events of early March 1953. According to his version, his father had been deliberately denied treatment and had died as a result of betrayal by his inner circle, but none of those who could have confirmed his words dared to defy the new leadership. Their silence dealt another blow to his hopes. His personal life offered no comfort. His wives had left him, his children were raised far from their father, and every meeting was steeped in awkwardness and estrangement. He tried to regain the goodwill of old friends, but the circle of loyal people was shrinking. Even former military comrades avoided eye contact. Being seen as Vasily's ally had become dangerous. He remained isolated, surrounded by whispers and the cold scrutiny of the KGB. Once again, drinking took control. Vasily became a regular at Moscow restaurants and private parties, where he spoke too freely and irritated the authorities. Every phrase was recorded, every toast produced more denunciations. The newspapers stayed silent about him, but in party corridors they said that Stalin's son behaved like a ticking time bomb. The new leadership could not allow someone with such a name to speak openly about crimes committed against his family. The turning point came in the summer of 1961, when Vasily was summoned for a conversation at the Kremlin. He was told directly, "You have no right to bear that name. You have no right to disgrace the country." He tried to defend himself, recalling his military achievements and shouting that he was a war hero who had given everything to the motherland. But his interlocutors remained unmoved. In their eyes, he was not an ace pilot, but a dangerous symbol of the past, one that needed erasure. That autumn, a new blow followed. He was arrested once more. This time the charges were even more absurd. Hooliganism, public drunkenness, slander against the party leadership. The case mentioned not only his drinking, but also his statements about a conspiracy surrounding his father's death. Historians believe that the real reason was simple. Vasily reminded society too loudly of a time Khrushchev was trying to erase from history. The trial was once again closed and swift. The sentence, several more years of confinement and exile to Kazan, where he was to spend the remainder of his life under state surveillance. For Vasily, this became final confirmation that he would never return to his past, never clear his name, and never learn the truth about his father's last days. As he was escorted out of the courtroom, one of the guards heard him whisper, "I am not the son of an enemy of the people. I am the son of a murdered leader, and that is why I am punished." This phrase remained in the memory of witnesses, a bitter conclusion to his life, a life broken by the fear and intrigues of others. Ahead lay years of illness, despair, and slow decline. Far from Moscow, far from the army, far from everything that had once given his life meaning. But even in exile, he still believed that one day the truth would prevail, though far too late for him. The final years and the tragic end. How did the drama of the leader's son conclude? The winter of 1962 greeted Vasily Stalin in Kazan. A city far from Moscow's intrigues seemed quiet and peaceful, but the silence was deceptive. For the leader's son, it became yet another stage of an invisible prison, where every word was recorded, every step monitored, and life itself turned into a slow wait for the end. He was settled in a small, almost shabby apartment in the city center, There was no honor guard, no privilege, only stern plainclothes agents who, coincidentally, passed him in the street and always knew where he had been, with whom he spoke, and what he drank. Neighbors recalled that Vasily looked broken, yet not resigned. At times, he said he still hoped to return to Moscow and prove the truth about his father's final days. More often, however, he drank in silence, staring at one spot as if speaking with the ghosts of the past. His health rapidly deteriorated. War injuries, prison, alcohol, and constant stress steadily eroded his body. The once legendary ace pilot, decorated for aerial combat, now struggled to climb stairs and grew breathless after a short walk. Doctors wrote in their reports cirrhosis of the liver, chronic bronchitis, psychosomatic disorders. But the real sickness lay deeper. Longing for his father, for a lost world, for a past where he had been not an outcast, but a hero. Historians note that during this period, Vasily became even more absorbed in investigating his father's death. He wrote letters to former guards, demanded meetings with doctors, and collected even the most improbable rumors. He was convinced that his father had not died a natural death. According to witnesses, he said, "They killed him, and now they are killing me slowly so that I stay silent." These words were dangerous, and KGB agents recorded them with particular care. His only respite was the memory of war. On rare days when he was sober, he told local boys how he piloted a yak, fought against Messerschmitts, and saved comrades while under enemy fire. In those moments, his eyes lit up again, his voice grew firm, and he seemed to return to a time when he was respected and feared, when the Stalin name signified honor, not shame. But each morning brought a sense of emptiness. The bottle replaced sleepy, and the Kazan winter felt colder with loneliness. In the spring of 1967, Vasily's condition worsened to the point that he was hospitalized. Doctors made no effort to conceal the truth. His body was destroyed, his days were numbered. Yet even on the hospital bed, he did not remain silent. In one of his final conversations with a close friend, he said, "I never lived my own life. I was punished for being his son, but I do not renounce it." These words became his unspoken testament. On the night of the 9th of March 1962, Vasily was found unconscious. According to official records, cardiac arrest triggered by alcohol intoxication and cirrhosis complications. Unofficially, rumors spread that someone may have helped him depart, to permanently silence a man who knew too much. The truth was never established, and even in death he remained a figure of silent conspiracy, just like his father. He was buried in Kazan, without military honors, without the general's rank he had once worn with pride. His grave bore no full name, only the inscription, Vasily Iosifovich. History seemingly erased him from the memory of the nation for which he had fought and to which he had given everything. Only decades later did historians begin to reconstruct his fate. Another image emerged, not merely that of a reckless dictator's son, but of a man deformed by others' struggle for power, broken by a system terrified even of Stalin's shadow. But for Vasily himself, this belated interest meant nothing. He died forgotten, betrayed, destroyed by silence. Silence colder and more merciless than any accusation. His tragic end became a reflection of his time. The era that had created the cult of the leader spared not even his children. The fate of Vasily stands as a reminder that in Soviet history, no one was untouchable. That power could raise a man to the pedestal and just as swiftly crush him, leaving one of the most famous sons of the nation in an unmarked grave. Thus ended the life of a man who was born as a prince of the empire, became a war hero, and died a prisoner of his own surname. History took from him everything, power, honor, hope, but it could not erase the darkest truth. The leader's son lived his life as a hostage to the fears and intrigues of others. We have traced the path from Vasily's childhood, filled with privilege and the shadows of his powerful father, to his tragic end, forgotten and betrayed by the very country he had served. History gave him no right to error, yet granted no chance for redemption. He was a war hero, the leader's son, and at the same time, the most dangerous man to the new regime. Not because he held a weapon, but because he knew too much, spoke too openly, and bore a surname that made even those who once overthrew its power tremble. We have only brushed the surface of this story, but behind it lie dozens more secrets buried deep in the archives. How many such lives were broken by silence and fear? How much truth lies forever entombed alongside the names of those who became victims of their own era? Subscribe to the channel, for ahead lie even darker, more tangled, and more shocking stories. Sometimes the past does not knock with a fist, but whispers quietly from the grave, and our task is to hear it before the silence buries it forever.